Um, First of all, I want to say that it's really a privilege to be here and be the first speaker in this amazing series. There are really a lot of interesting other talks coming. And also on Martin Luther King Day, it just somehow feels right to be doing this. So happy to be here with all of you. Jen said, I've been working in the field of gerontology and geriatrics for 50 years. It's almost, I think we're at 48. And I've been thinking about aging in place that whole time. Over the years, there are many clients and friends and family that I've helped with this issue. And now in my 70s and my husband in his late 80s, we're facing this ourselves. So some of the examples I'm going to give today are from our situation and what we're doing to try and age in place and trying to be prepared. So I'm ready for the first slide. So probably the most important thing here is to plan ahead. You know, in our society, people don't like to think about aging. Elderly and old are kind of dirty words in our culture. And one of the things that people do like to think about is independence and really dislike thinking about having to accept help or make accommodations to age. But really, it's so important. And as I say here, you may be in great shape now, but stuff happens. And I'm guessing that most of those of you who are out there on this talk are approaching the older years yourself if you're not already there. And you know that stuff is happening to you, to people in your family, to your friends. Like it or not, most of us will have some disability at some point, and it really requires thinking about this. Next slide, please. So this is, every year the Administration on Aging puts out a pamphlet called Profiles in Older Americans, and this is from the 2021 that came out in the fall. You can Google that if you're interested. There are all kinds of facts and figures about aging. I used to use these extensively when I was teaching aging related classes. This particular slide is physical functioning among people over age 65, and you can see different kinds of disability there, but 40% of people start to have difficulty with mobility. That is a huge one. And that is something that physically, sometimes we can do some things to prepare for. That's certainly been an issue in my family. My mother had, toward the end of her life, a lot of mobility problems, and my husband does now. So we're in the midst of thinking this through. Next slide, please. It increases with age. 71% of people over 80 have some disability. Now that there are lots of different kinds of disabilities, obviously, but that means nearly 3/4 of us are going to have some sort of disability that we may need to design accommodations for. And that's what I want you to think about, is what ways, you can begin planning ahead. Next slide, please. People in the health field think about disability in a lot of different ways. I threw this slide in just to get you thinking about this. You may have heard in clinics or in doctors' offices, people talking about ADLs or IADLs. Instrumental activities of daily living include driving and shopping, taking care of your medications, being able to handle your finances, and there's some others as well. Um, and very often that's where people start having difficulty first. But of course, it depends on what kind of disabilities you develop. So if you develop problems with your vision, for example, that's going to affect driving and maybe some of these other things. If you develop Parkinson's disease or severe arthritis or have a stroke, you may have trouble with the activities of daily living, which include the things that we do to take care of our bodies. And I've given you some examples here. Other folks have categorized disability in many different ways, but I just included these because I want you to start thinking about it and thinking about what accommodations you might need to make at various points and what you can do ahead. So mobility includes walking, stairs, transportation. Self-care is the same really as activities of daily living. And then household activities, all the things we do to keep our homes running smoothly. Next slide, please. You said we were going to age in place, and this is my place, she says. I think of this as my head in the sand cartoon. And honestly, over the years, I've worked with so many people who did not want to think about aging and sort of refused to think about it or plan for it. And did the equivalent of lying in the hammock reading a book while things started to collapse around them. And this is what we want to avoid if we can. Next slide, please. So the more you plan ahead, the better. Part of this is learning to accept help. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But first, I want to talk about assessing your home for aging in place, wherever you're living. If you're healthy now, or if you're starting to have some disabilities, now is a good time to do this. So that you can figure out, are there things that it makes sense to do now? And I'll give you some examples of what we did. And what kinds of things might you be able to do or need to do in the future, but you don't necessarily have to do them now. And it may be as you really assess the space that you live in, you'll figure out that you can't really age in place there very well. And let me tell you, I live in a house that my husband and I have been in this house 41 years. It's over 100 years old. We've made a lot of accommodations, and I'm going to share some of those with you, but it has become increasingly clear to both of us that there is a limit. We have aged in place up to this point, but there's a point that we can't go beyond, and we do need to move at some point. And I have been looking at condos for the last 4 years, and we're moving rapidly toward that. So educating yourself about alternatives is part of this. Almost all of us want to stay in our homes. We love our neighborhood. We love our location, but realistically, this house is not going to work for us for the rest of our lives. So starting to think about this, starting to talk about it, talking to your family and friends about it is a really helpful place to start, I think. Next slide, please. Start with the entrances to your home. Can a disabled person get in and out of your home? This became clear to us about 20 years ago when a friend brought his mother in a wheelchair over to our house. We had to carry her up the front steps to get her into the house. And she could kind of wheel around our living room and our dining room and our kitchen, but we couldn't get her around the corners into the bathroom because this house is very old and the hallways are very narrow and the doorways are narrow, and there's no real way to adjust that. So that needing a wheelchair is the point where we have to move. So as you're thinking about entrances to your home, some might be better than others. Our front steps, my mother moved in with us about 7 or 8 years ago when she was 90, and the front steps were a problem. And I brought in a couple of companies to talk to me about putting a ramp in. Turns out our front door is too close to the sidewalk and the elevation is too steep. And they would have had to put a ramp all the way snaking across our entire front yard. It was going to be about $7,000 and there would be no yard left and it would be a long, long ramp. So that didn't seem to make sense. They also have outside elevators that are also not cheap, but what they do is build a platform over the stairs, and then there's a little lift to the side of that that lifts the person up to the platform and the door level. So we considered that, but it didn't look like my mother was going to be here long term, and we did not do that. We did put railings up, and that helped. But thinking about entrances is really helpful. Last summer, I had to have foot surgery and I could not put any weight on one of my feet for several weeks. I used a walker and could get around the house, but I couldn't figure out how I was going to get in and out of the house. So next slide, please. What I ended up doing was buying little ramps over the internet. These were not terribly expensive. And this is the back door of our house, going first onto the back porch and then into the bedroom. But the bedroom is 2 large steps down from the hallway. So I had to buy a longer ramp for that. And it's too steep, really. My husband is using a walker all the time now, so he can get in and out of the house. But coming down this steep ramp is tricky. So, excuse me, we also put in a very sturdy railing on those steps. These ramps fold up, they can come up and down really easily. So that's been a good accommodation. I could get in and out of the house, and my husband now can get in and out of the house. Next slide, please. One level living is often the ideal. So that's something else to think about. Can you live on one level if you have to? Do you have a full bath? Do you have some place where you can put a bed? I mean, I've certainly known many people who have put beds in their living room or their dining room when they needed to. I've known people who could not get to their full bathroom and did sponge baths or washed up in a half bathroom for years at a time. I think for most of us, that's not ideal. So that's something to think about. If you have stairs, can you install equipment to make multi-level living possible? Next slide, please. This is an example of a stair lift. I took this image off the internet. My mother had a stair lift in her condo in California that allowed her to stay in her house for an extra 3 or 4 years at least. Plus, it was great for getting the laundry up and downstairs. And when I visited, I put my suitcase on it. So these are not cheap, but for some people, they allow them to stay in place. Next slide, please. This cartoon says, ladies, you know the rule about joyriding. It's a silly cartoon, but one of the reasons I put it in here is because these lifts are very slow, and that does drive some people crazy, but they work. They can be very expensive, but sometimes you can find used ones for less money. Uh, I have known two friends who lived in three-story homes and put stair lifts in that actually went around the stairs so they could go all the way from the first floor to the third floor without ever getting off of the seat. They can be risky for some people if you have somebody who's not really safe sitting up. Most of them have seat belts. Also, children sometimes want to play on them, and pets can get in the way. So there are a lot of things to think about, but they do, I think for many, many people, they've allowed them to stay in their homes when they lived on several levels. Next slide, please. So falls are a big cause of disability, of needing to make accommodations. They're the leading cause of unintentional injuries among people over the age of 65. I'm not sure what an intentional injury is. I think maybe that's not the right word there. Some of the common causes of falls: loose carpets. Lots and lots of us have throw rugs or carpets with corners around the house, and tripping becomes really hazardous for a lot of us as we grow older. Cords is something to watch out for. So when you're walking through your house, doing a walkthrough and thinking about how you're going to make your house accommodate aging in place, these are all things to really pay attention to. Coffee tables tend to be low. They tend to be in the middle of the room. They often, I mean, we have moved our furniture around quite a bit to accommodate the use of walkers, and gotten rid of some of the furniture as well. Small steps or even thresholds that have a little bit of a change in the floor surface can cause people to trip. So paying attention to those things can be important. And if you have a really big threshold or just one step, one of those small ramps that I showed you can be really, really helpful for that situation. Poor lighting is another cause of falls, and I'll talk a little more about lighting in a few minutes. Next slide, please. This is our basement steps in our 100-year-old house, and the accommodations we'd made, we always had a railing, but it had old carpeting on the stairs and it was getting slippery. A year or two ago, we put a second railing in and we tore the carpeting up and we put non-treads, non-skid treads on the stairs. And that has made it so much better for both my husband and me. Next slide, please. Bathrooms are often a place where you really need to make accommodations. Grab bars, I'm going to talk about all of these and show you some examples. I think this is an area where people don't always think ahead, but it really is useful to do so. Next slide, please. So this is one of our bathrooms, the one that's on the ground floor. And we renovated it 7 or 8 years ago. And we did so because we were getting older, but also we thought my mother might be spending more time here, and it turned out she did. One of the things I found was handle towel bars and toilet paper holders that are grab bars. So these were installed by somebody who put them in the studs. And to the right of that towel bar is the sink. My mother would stand at the sink and often just hold on to the towel bar. Many accidents have happened, and certainly they happened to my mother in her condo. When people lose their balance, they grab a towel bar and the towel bar comes out of the wall because it's not made to be a grab bar. but this one is, and it really has been helpful. You can see here, if you look at the toilet, that it's a very narrow space. The shower is to the right, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. When I had my foot surgery and I could not put weight on my left foot, I was using a walker and hopping around the house. To get to the toilet, because it was so narrow and the walker was so wide, I had to hop backwards through the bathroom to get to the toilet. And again, that was when I thought, okay, we're not staying in this house. There's not any way really to make this bathroom bigger. And as we get older and possibly more disabled, this just doesn't make sense. Next slide, please. At the same time, at various points, we needed handles on the toilet. And there are lots of different frames that you can buy. I think probably some of you have them or you've seen them. The one on the left is a frame that just fits over the toilet. Our space was too narrow for that. None of the frames like that fit in our space. But the one on the right, where I bought the handles like that on the internet, again, they were not expensive and they were very easy to install. Because I was able to measure it, they fit, and that made all the difference when I had my foot surgery, was having those handles. There was something else I was going to say about the toilet frames. Oh, some of the frames also have raised toilet seats, which for some people and some disabilities, that's really helpful. Next slide, please. These older homes are tricky. You never know what kind of pipes you'll find. Again, this is silly, but I liked it. We did renovate the shower or the bathtub, which I'm going to show you next. And this certainly speaks to dealing with plumbing in old homes or old apartments or condos. Next slide, please. So we had a standard sized bathtub in this bathroom, and we had it taken out and a shower put in, a walk-in shower put in that space. We did that before my mom came, maybe a year or two before. And boy, has it been worth doing. It made it possible for my mother to shower by herself or with a little help from me. It's possible for me when I had my foot surgery. It's made it possible for my husband now with some mobility and balance problems. The designers wanted to put one of those little corner benches in that you see in a lot of showers, walk-in showers. And I said no, because I've known older people as clients who have fallen off those little corner seats or didn't fit on them. They look kind of nice, but they're not very practical. So we had a bench seat put in, and that's made a huge difference. So it's possible to sit down if we want to put stuff there. And we had a non-skid floor put in the shower as well, but when there's soap or shampoo on it, it's not truly non-skid, but we have a really good bath mat hanging there that works very well. And that bath mat is hanging on a really good grab bar. And there is another one that we'll show you in the next slide, please. So we had a handheld shower installed, and I really recommend this. It really is helpful. When sometimes people reach a point where they can't really stand in the shower anymore, or they need help in the shower, the handheld sprayer makes a big difference. So the entrance to our shower has that long grab bar right there, which has been so helpful. I can't say enough about putting in a walk-in shower. The other kind of walk-in showers are the ones that are truly wheelchair accessible, that where there's no lip. Ours has a tiny lip, but that hasn't really caused issues for any of us who've used it so far. Um, and again, it depends a lot on space, what you're able to do. This is the only bathroom on the ground floor. We have very steep steps going to a second floor, and there's another bath up there, but my husband can't get up there anymore. So this one has been really important. Next slide, please. Also, there are shower chairs. Some of you may have used them or you may have one. This is a very standard one that goes, if you keep the bathtub, it fits over the bathtub and you sit on the outside, have to be able to swing your legs over and then slide across so that you're in the tub, and then you use a handheld sprayer. Most people who are using a chair like this aren't able to get down into the tub anymore. They have much fancier versions of these, though. When I was looking on the internet a little bit, there are some that have swivel seats that slide across on bars, and there are also our bathtub lifts where a person can be like a hydraulic lift, that the person can be lifted up and across and then placed down in the water inside the tub. Those are expensive. And again, you have to be sure you have enough space in the bathroom for that. Also for a wheelchair, if you're thinking about accommodations, wheelchairs take a lot of space and you need to be able to move around and turn around. And a wheelchair can't even get into our bathroom, let alone turn around in it. Thank you. Next slide, please. So a few other considerations as you're thinking about your house and the layout of the rooms. I did this recently for an older friend who has developed serious mobility problems. And she and I went through she lives in a tri-level condo. And we walked through the whole house. And in the living room, we thought about how to declutter it, move some of the furniture out of the way because she was having trouble getting her walker around stuff. So that's been sort of reorganized. We looked at the dining room chairs. She had very nice dining room chairs. None of them have handles or arms on them for help getting up. I have recently bought a couple of office side chairs on the internet that I put together myself that were not terribly expensive, but they have good handles. And we now have those at our dining room table because it's much easier for my husband to get up. So I recommended that my friend get at least one chair with arms on it so she can easily get up and down from the dining room table. I also have recommended that she get stair elevators. She does have double banisters on both sets of stairs, and maybe that is enough. She's still debating that, but she is having her bathtub taken out and walk-in shower put in place. So those are a few things to think about. Lighting is also important to think about. All of us, as we grow older, need more lighting. I'm sure most of you out there have become aware of that, and perhaps increase the lighting in your areas. One thing to know about that is that when people start developing balance problems, sometimes they become very disoriented in the dark. There's something that goes on with the brain that just makes it harder to negotiate the dark when you have balance problems. So my husband fell a couple of times in the living room when he was going to bed and had turned all the lights out. And we now leave a light on in the living room. You also want to think about lighting from the bed to the bathroom and make sure there's a clear pathway, make sure that you've got adequate lighting or night lights or whatever you need to be able to see where you're going. Because falls in the night are not uncommon, and lighting makes all the difference. I want to talk for a minute about home maintenance, and then we'll talk about laundry areas. I think one of the things that sometimes really chases people out of their homes is home maintenance, having to deal with that. And that can become, particularly if you develop disabilities or everything just becomes harder for some people as we age. Having to deal with the maintenance of a home, having to deal with snow and yard work and roofs and driveways, all of those things can make it feel sort of untenable at some point. So that is something to think about as you're thinking about aging in place. Can you hire that work done? Can you afford to hire that work done? What's that going to cost? Next slide, please. Oh, poorly lit staircase, just an example of that. One of the things, in addition, it's very important to have good lighting over stairs. It's really easy to miss steps, particularly a bottom step. And one of the things that many people do is paint a stripe, or what I did for a while on the bottom step of our basement stairs, I put yellow tape on it so that it was bright and you could see it and it distinguished it from other steps. Sometimes people put tape or paint a white stripe on all of the steps so that it's much easier to see them when you're going down them. Particularly basement steps, I think, are hard, but a lot of accidents happen when people miss the bottom step on a staircase. Next slide, please. So laundry areas, I think lots of people have adapted by getting stacking washers and dryers or having those on the main floor or on the bedroom floor. We looked at our spaces in our house and it just was not feasible in this house. Another reason that we're going to get out of here at some point. Next slide, please. This is the accommodation that I have made in our house. So this is in our basement. We had to get a new washer and I had them put it on a pedestal, which you can buy separately from a washer and dryer. So it's now up at a height where I can easily take things in and out. And then I bought that laundry basket also up at that height. So I still have to get the laundry up and down the stairs, but once I'm in the basement, it's far easier to do than it used to be, where I had to bend way over for the washer and dryer. And that's an accommodation that I made a couple of years ago that has really helped our aging in place. Next slide, please. So when doesn't it work to age in place? Well, I've told you some of the things that are not working so well for us and why we are eventually going to move. I've listed some here. I'm sure there are many others, but home maintenance for many people just gets to be too much. Even if you can hire people, sometimes it just becomes too much, or it can become too expensive. Some homes, like ours, can't be modified enough. And at some point, many people, not everybody, but many people need to start bringing help into the home to help with, sometimes it's with instrumental activities of daily living. It might be cleaning or cooking, or but it might also be with personal care, helping a disabled older person with bathing, or other things, food preparation. So sometimes if you think about bringing help into the home, that can be a hard step to get over. For many people, needing help and accepting help are not the same thing. And I really encourage everybody out there to think hard about how well you'll be able to accept help when you need it. I think a lot of us may have experienced with parents or grandparents, people who really needed help and really did not want help and didn't want to bring in strangers or outside help. And it became very difficult for family to provide the help that was needed, or sometimes they wouldn't even let family help. So I really always encourage people to think about one of the ways to age gracefully is to learn to accept help when it's needed and to be realistic about the help that you may need. Some spaces where people live, apartments or condos or homes, don't have enough space to accommodate overnight help if that is needed. And sometimes it is at some point. Sometimes there's just too much physical disability to cope with the space that people live in. Um, I'm not really talking about cognitive disability today, but I've worked with many, many families over the years who were caring for somebody who had a form of dementia. And as the dementia progressed, they really wanted to keep the person at home. And sometimes people are able to do that, but more often there comes a point where it just doesn't work in the home setting anymore. And for that person with dementia, aging in place just isn't feasible really at a certain point for some people. Some people don't have enough family or friend support around. I know an older woman right now who is in her early 90s, still lives in her family home, is a widow, doesn't have children, has one relative in Connecticut, and she's trying very hard to stay at home. And she does have a little bit of help, not enough, and she doesn't want more. But I'm skeptical that she's going to be able to age in place in that home because she's starting to have some cognitive problems. All of the support is long distance, and there isn't very much of it anyway. So that is sometimes a cause of why people can't stay in the space they want to. Sometimes people have too much medical equipment, oxygen tanks, and walkers and wheelchairs, and they just don't have the space in the place where they're living. And I think for many older people, this has gotten a lot of publicity lately, that being at home becomes too isolating for some people, especially if you develop some disability and you're alone, or maybe you're alone with a partner, but still it can be terribly isolating if getting out is not easy anymore. And for some people, it actually is better to live in a congregate setting of some kind, or to move to an apartment building where there are more people around. So that is another reason why I think aging in place doesn't always work for people. Next slide, please. Honey, we need to decide if we're going to add on or go conquer somebody with a bigger castle. And this is the point that a lot of people get to. Are they going to, I know a family who was trying to decide whether to add on a mother-in-law room on the back of their house, and they discovered it was just way too expensive. They couldn't really afford to do that. And they're weighing whether or not to buy a bigger house. So the mother-in-law, or the mother, she's the mother of one of them, has a place to live. And if they can find something that has a master with a bath on the first floor, but still enough room for the rest of the family. Lots of things to think about if you reach a point where you think you probably need to move. Next slide, please. So alternatives. I think it's always good to think about this. It's always good to have conversations with family about this. So many people don't want to look forward, don't want to think about having to leave the home that they're living in, don't want to think about accepting help. But I think the more that you can talk about this stuff, the more you can think about it, the more smoothly it will go. Over the years, I have, probably been involved in several hundred decisions about moving, many of them people with dementia, but not all of them. And they're never easy decisions, and there aren't always good alternatives. But the people who did it the most smoothly, I would say, are the people who had thought about it ahead and had looked around to see what was available, to see what they could afford. Looking around never hurts. I mean, you can visit places, or maybe right now with COVID, you have to do a video visit or just look online. But at least you can begin to get a sense of what's out there, what might work, what might not work, what you can afford, what you can't afford, what's comparable to what you have now or better in some ways. So some people move to apartments or condos. Sometimes I've known many families who've ended up cohabiting, and certainly I think that's happened a lot during COVID. And I imagine in some cases it's changed how people are thinking about this, and maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. But when people are having trouble aging in place, moving in with relatives is often a decision that some people make. Or having someone move in with you, whether it's a relative or someone else, looking at whether you have a space in your current home where somebody could come in and stay with you if they needed to. Or maybe it's just overnight help. Do you have a place where somebody could stay overnight if you needed that? Many people choose assisted living. I think during COVID, that has become a more difficult option for people, although I know several people who've moved to assisted living recently. It's, again, it tends to be expensive, and as does home care. I think these are all things to think about, what you would want if you need them or when you need them. Next slide, please. This is something I always said to my students and to people I supervised. It's still true. I still have to remind myself of it, and I want to remind you of it. Adults have the right to make bad decisions as long as they are considered competent. So there are lots of people out there in the world who are living in very risky situations, living in places that are not sanitary. There are people who are hoarders. There are people who are disabled, having a really difficult time managing in their space. But people have the right to make that decision in our country at this time. And it's important, I think, to keep that in mind. I think this is particularly frustrating for adult children. Maybe some of you are in that situation now with parents or have been in the past. And Sometimes it's a matter of just biding your time, but it's important to remind yourself that we, at whatever age we are, want to make our own decisions about our bodies and our lives for as long as we can. And that doesn't change for most people as they get older. They still want to make their own decisions. So even though you think this person would be better off in a different setting, that doesn't mean that she is going to make that decision. Next slide, please. So in summary, plan ahead now. I really just think that's such a useful thing to do. Do a walkthrough of your home. What could be done now to make your home more accommodating that will help you later, perhaps, or even help you now? And then what other things might you want to do in the long term that you can just kind of keep in the back of your mind as a possibility? Talk to your family and talk to your friends and be open to possibilities and be open to accepting help when you need it. I think that probably above all is the thing I've seen that's made so many families have a difficult time with aging is when people are not willing to accept help. The other thing that I didn't really say much about, but I think is really important, is look at your finances and look at, do you have long-term care insurance? Do you have the possibility of an annuity or of a reverse mortgage if you need to do those things? If you need more help or if you need to make accommodations to your home, or if you need to move, what is your financial plan going forward? I think it's also a very important piece of planning ahead. Next slide, please. I have listed a few resources on these next couple of slides. First couple are local resources. So if it would be helpful to sit down and talk to somebody about some of this, to find out what the options are, to just talk it through with someone. The Housing Bureau for Seniors, which is part of U of M, is a good place to start. Turner Senior Resource Center has people who are very knowledgeable and also have access to lots of resources. Next slide, please. Area Agency on Aging 1B, which serves 6 counties, including Washtenaw County, is a good place to get resource information about the 6 counties that they serve, about housing options, about help that's available in the community. Jewish Family Services of Washtenaw County has a very good aging program and care managers on staff who also can be helpful. There also are some geriatric care managers in the community. I didn't put that on this slide, but in the 1990s, I had a geriatric care management business, which is a private business. Usually they are nurses or social workers who are care managers. It's private pay and it tends to be on the expensive side. Some care managers will come in and do an assessment of your situation, of your home, help you sort of plan for the future, and it might just be a one-time thing. Other care managers might be involved in the long term. So the lady I mentioned a few minutes ago, who I know who lives by herself and her only relative is out of town, and she has some mild memory loss, I recommended to the family that they think about hiring a geriatric care manager for her who could set up care and monitor it. And I know that she can afford that. So whether they'll choose to do it, I don't know. But for people who can afford that, it can be a very useful service And then there are commercial companies out there that do things like install ramps, put up grab bars, do other kinds of physical accommodations. Next slide, please. These are just a few aging in place resources that I found online. The first three are. The last two are about safety and falls. So I just included all of those. I think Jen mentioned this at the beginning, I did provide a handout version of this. I mean, it's a PowerPoint, but I took some of the things out and simplified it a little bit. So that is available for people who might want it afterwards. And I think I am ready for questions.
Okay, thank you, Beth. I appreciate that. Fantastic presentation. The resources that Beth mentioned, don't worry about reaching out to us. I will actually take a few moments to email those to everyone who registered for this session after the presentation today. So you should find that in your email boxes a little bit later today. I did want to take just a moment. First of all, for anyone who has questions, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we have a few already. We'll let a few others compile. And while people are putting in their questions, I did just want to take a moment again to thank the committee that put together this Aging in Place presentation today, as well as the entire Healthy Aging series, The Art and Science of Successful Aging, and just mention a few folks. On that committee, Barbara Huberman, Shannon Echeverry, Edna Gray, Gloria Edwards, Nancy Becker-Jackson, Steve Geringer, Catherine Wu, Francis Schultz, Lori Barnett, Jane Spinner, Erica Solway, and Trish Meyer. And I wanted to let everyone know that this series is actually a collaboration between the Turner Senior Wellness Program, OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, Silver Club Memory Programs, the Geriatric Center at the University of Michigan, and IHPI, the Institute for Healthcare Policy and Innovation. We're very proud to have this offering for you. Also, our next presentation in the series is this Friday, January 21st, which is Technology for Aging in Place with Dr. Richard Caro. So I hope that you're able to make it to many more of these presentations. All right, Beth, I'm going to go ahead and dig into the questions for you. The first one is, I've heard that handbars on a slope, as shown, can be dangerous. A person might grab them, then slide down. I think that's more of a comment, but maybe a question as well.
Oh, that's interesting. I have not heard that. And the one that we have that was on a slope, I specifically designed it that way because if you're sitting on the bench in the shower, you can easily grab that to pull yourself up. I don't know if that's interesting. Not heard that before.
I will make one comment that we recently worked with a falls prevention specialist, one of our doctors here at U of M, and an occupational therapist that he works with who recommended the sloped bars for the reason that you just said. So I hadn't heard that either, but had actually heard the opposite, that it helps in fall prevention.
Yeah, we've found them incredibly helpful in the shower. When I could only stand on one foot, I just can't tell you how the grab bars saved me.
Okay, all right, thank you, Beth. Next question is, when you have looked at condos in the Ann Arbor area, have you found many that are one floor with wide doors that are wheelchair friendly, or that have the master suite on the first floor of the two levels? Or is it hard to find in our area?
I think it's very hard to find. I've been looking for 4 years. I've looked at tons of them. There are some, most of them don't have wide enough doors. There are some being built right now on the edges of town in 2 or 3 different locations. And one of them that I did tour, they did a really nice job with that. But they're really expensive and they're way out on the edge of town. So that's kind of a trade-off. I mean, as I'm looking, I'm thinking about that all the time. And there aren't a lot that I've seen.
Okay, thank you. This is a very interesting question, Beth, probably a complicated one. One person says, speak to the word competent. Is you quoted that adults have the right to make bad decisions as long as they are competent?
Right. Competence actually is something that's determined by a physician. Wait, have I got the right one? One's a legal term and one's a medical term. Um, and I don't really want to get into that, but I would say that it really requires a doctor to declare someone that. Uh, well, I think it's. Oh, Jen. Can you help me here? Is it is it a judge that declares someone incompetent? I think it is, but I think it's on the recommendations of a physician. Does that sound right?
I do believe it's a legal term, but it is determined by usually a couple of different physicians that agree that somebody
Yeah.
is beyond the point of competence and making decisions on their own competently. But yeah, I think in order for someone to, when we're talking about guardianship and those types of issues, that's when the courts need to get involved and doctors also need to be involved. And it's a very gray area. Nobody wants to, I think, deem someone incompetent to make their own decisions. It's a very tough thing to do, but sometimes necessary.
Yeah. And this is where I'm feeling my retirement. I've been retired a while. I used to talk about this stuff all the time, but um, I think, as Jen said, it is a very gray area. I just wanted to throw that out there, though, because I've had so many, usually adult children, say to me, but my mother shouldn't be able to live this way, should she? And mom may be stubborn. She may be mentally ill. She may even have a little bit of dementia, but she is still considered competent. And she has a right to live that way, even if we don't like it or if we see it as risky.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, the next question is, how do you find outside help that you can verify is how can you verify that outside help, I guess, is reliable and trustworthy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, right now is a very unusual time. It's hard to find outside help now. It A few years ago, there were many home health agencies. They had a lot of staff, and you could shop around some. I think that my experience recently in trying to help some friends with this, I called some home health agencies, and a lot of them now are having a terrible time getting and retaining staff. There's issues about pay, but of course, there's also issues about childcare and about COVID and masking and vaccinations. There are just so many issues right now that make it hard. So, I would recommend if you're looking for outside help that you sit down with someone, perhaps at the resource center or JFS or someplace. And you can also look online and find a list of some of the questions that are important to ask. You want to know if people have had background checks. You want to know if they are vaccinated and masked and um, bonded, all those kinds of questions. People, many people also hire people privately that they find, and sometimes word of mouth is the best way to find someone. I've also, over the years, recommended to a lot of people who needed help. If they had someone who was cleaning for them, who had been doing it for a long time, sometimes that person is open to helping in other ways as well. And it's someone that you already know. Um, but it's a tough issue right now, tougher than usual, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with you. The next question is, did you use a special disability designer to find the grab bar, bathroom fixtures, and accommodations?
No, I mean, we went to one of these kitchen and bathroom renovation places, but I told them what I wanted. They had kind of a standard model and it had that little corner tiny seat. And they had various kinds of grab bars that they showed me, and I picked out the ones that I wanted. I had heard somehow or other about the towel bars that were grab bars and requested that they find those and put those in. And as I say, those have been extremely helpful.
All right, thank you. And the next question, this might be another more legal question, but can the state step in and take control of a senior's finances and care?
If someone is declared not competent, then a judge, there is a court hearing, and the person has their own attorney, and someone can be appointed guardian or conservator. A guardian is the person who makes medical decisions and living decisions, and a conservator is the person who manages their money. And we always encourage people to try and use powers of attorney, durable powers of attorney, to hopefully avoid having to go to court. It's a big deal to go to court. It's not fun. And you have to report to the court on a regular basis. So you really feel like, I think the person who has a guardian or conservator often feels like control has been taken away from them by the state. Although many times it's a relative who becomes the guardian or the conservator, but not always. Sometimes it's a court-appointed person who they don't even know.
All right, thank you, Beth. Someone wanted to mention that AAA 1B has a caregiving coaching program for people who are caregivers and need some moral support and help with identifying resources.
Great.
Yep, which is absolutely fantastic. Yes, AAA 1B is a great place to reach out to for help, as well as some of the other places that Beth had mentioned. So thank you for that comment. And let's see, another person said, are the commercial companies that you referenced, putting up grab bars, ramps, etc., just standard builders or specific to disability, looks like remediation?
I think they're both. But for example, when I was looking for ramps for the front of our house 7 or 8 years ago, and I just went online and looked, there were a couple of companies that specialized in what they called aging in place accommodations. They did ramps, they did grab bars, they did stair elevators. So, but I think also standard builders can do all of those things.
Okay. All right, thank you. Someone asked, do you know of any apartment buildings for renters where there are few steps or have elevators so the renter does not have to worry about climbing stairs in the Ann Arbor area?
Well, interesting you should say that. I started looking around when a friend was unexpectedly in a wheelchair, and I called, and another friend, we sort of both called a number of these places in town. If you look up handicap accessible or wheelchair accessible apartments, Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, you'll get a whole list that come up, but if you call them, it turns out that mostly they only have 1 or 2 units that are actually adapted for wheelchairs with the wide doorways. And some of them don't even have walk-in showers. They have wider doorways and they're all on one level. but I think there are quite a few apartments that are on one level and have elevators. Those are available. They're just not necessarily adaptable if you're in a wheelchair.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Beth. And also, as Beth mentioned before, the Housing Bureau for Seniors probably has pretty good lists and are familiar with who has which of those things available.
Right.
Okay, so someone says agreeing that you need help and being able to see your way to use your money for that help are two different things. What is the best way to help relatives who are in the bind?
Who are in the
I think what this person is asking is that some people may know that they need help, but just haven't um, gotten to the point where they are comfortable spending their money on help, or they might have a relative who doesn't want to spend their money on getting the help. And what recommendations do you have?
that is a tough one. and and it comes up all the time. And it is a balancing act. I just had this conversation with a friend last week who is very worried that she's going to outlive her money, and she has become quite frail and needs quite a bit of help. And she said, I don't know. If I'm bringing people in 4 or 5 days a week to help with cooking and laundry and changing the beds, that kind of stuff, it adds up to a lot of money. And am I going to run out before I die? Um, I'm not a financial planner. I think sometimes financial planners can be helpful with this kind of thing. But if you have an older person who is trying to hang on to their money, um, often it's because they want somebody to inherit it and they'd rather not spend it on themselves. One of the arguments that I've used sometimes, it doesn't always work, but sometimes it helps, is to have the adult children say, yes, I know you're saving money for me. On the other hand, right now you're burdening me greatly because you won't spend the money for the help and I have to provide it. Now hopefully they say it a little differently from that, but it sometimes comes down to being a burden versus spending your money. And I have sort of facilitated family meetings sometimes where we were very direct with an older person about that. Also, sometimes you use kind of scare tactics using statistics about falls and about injuries and what happens um, if you fall and need much more help and it's going to cost much more money. So helping people sort of think through those scenarios sometimes is helpful. There's no easy way to have that conversation, though, I have to say.
Agreed. The next question, this person says, thank you for this webinar. It was very helpful and informative. My question is whether you have any advice on how to have this conversation with a partner who keeps wanting to avoid talking about it.
Keeps wanting to
avoid talking about it.
Avoid talking about it.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think you kind of just have to keep bringing it up. And one way sometimes of getting into that conversation is talking about a third person. So for many years, I couldn't get my mother to talk about it, but I could, if something happened to one of her friends, we would talk about what happened to her friend and what could have been done. And I was able to gradually understand what she wanted and didn't want that way. She also wouldn't talk about dying or about funerals or any of that. But when one of her friends died, I took it as an occasion to talk to her about it and say, well, would you want what Frances had? Or what do you think about Frances's situation? What would you do in that situation? Sometimes it's less threatening if you can make the conversation be about somebody else, not about them. And then hopefully, eventually, you can sort of bring people around. But it's hard. I mean, I think some couples go into counseling for exactly that reason, to have those conversations. Um, that doesn't always work either. Some people have very strong denial instincts.
All right, thank you for that. One person says, are there any threshold times or situations to help make choices? And I was trying to, I wasn't sure I understood the question, but I think the question is about, are there any situations that might act as a catalyst for changes or to help
So,
people make choices about these?
yeah, I mean, certainly some diagnoses would do that. I think if you were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, or with perhaps mild cognitive impairment or early Alzheimer's, or rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, um, any of those kinds of um, diagnoses would be an important time, I think, to start thinking about those things. And it can be hard. You don't want to take hope away from people. That's part of what makes these conversations so hard. You don't want to take hope away, but you also want to be realistic. And that is part of why I started this talk by giving you the statistics on disability, um, and saying that planning ahead is really important, because things are going to happen to everybody before they die. Um, unless unless they die early and suddenly, and that's not how most people die. Most of us now are living into our 80s, many into their 90s, some into their hundreds, and we will develop chronic illnesses, or acute illnesses along the way, which are going to require some kind of adaptation in lifestyle. So diagnoses, I think, are one point. I know one man who, when he turned 80, he said, okay, now I realize I'm really getting old and I need to start thinking about the future. Most of us aren't that proactive, but he did start looking around and thinking about his house and where he wanted to live and what was going to happen. Um, Sudden loss of a partner or a spouse is another obvious point where people sometimes start thinking about that. I recently have been in touch with somebody who is in her 80s, and she's married to a man in his 80s, and he has a closed head injury, and that happened suddenly. And has really affected behavior and his ability to be at home. And so it's forcing them to make all kinds of changes quite quickly. And she could stay in her condo, but she's decided that this is the time for her to make a change too.
All right, I appreciate the perspective. Thanks, Beth. We had a couple of other questions, but one thing that I'm seeing is a bit of a theme with more legal and financial type of questions. I did want to point out to folks that in March, we have a series on needed resources and emergency preparedness, including a specialist in Social Security on March 4th. And then on March 11th, we have a financial advisor and an elder law attorney. And those would be excellent times to bring some of these questions that are related to aging in place to some legal and financial experts that maybe would be able to answer some of those questions as well.
Yeah, I think that's important. Don't ask me those questions. I am not a lawyer or a financial advisor. Um, but it's great that you have that. The other thing I just wanted to mention again is that on this Friday is the Aging in Place Technology Talk. And I opted not to talk at all about technology in my talk because I knew that I don't know what he's going to say. I'm hoping to hear it. But I wanted to give an example that I forgot. I am currently a volunteer with Meals on Wheels, and one of the homes that I go to, the man is bedbound, I think. He maybe has a wheelchair. I actually haven't met him, but he has a remote that allows him to unlock his front door. So when I'm there, I can call him or whatever. He knows I'm there, and then he remotely unlocks his front door so I can come in and put food in the refrigerator. And I think that's a great example of an adaptive technology for somebody. Some falls happen when people are trying to rush to the door when the doorbell rings. And this is one really nice solution to that.
Yeah, absolutely. As someone else mentions, Beth, the value of a lift chair, and says that when her 90-year-old father came to live with her, that that a lift chair recliner was very helpful.
Right, of course.
Yes. Yeah, so another piece of technology.
Yep.
So let me just make sure that we're pretty good on questions. Somebody was curious if you had data on the number of people who continue to live in place in their own homes versus living in more of like an assisted living type of situation.
I don't. I did actually look for that and didn't find anything. There are lots of surveys, and if you look at the profiles of older Americans, they always have some housing related statistics, but they don't break it down that way. So I really couldn't find that.
Yeah, and I just, as a point of reference, I do happen to know, because I have a lot of dementia statistics that live in my head all the time, but I know that there are more people who are living with dementia in their own homes than are in assisted living or nursing care. So I think a great number of people tend to live on their own in their own homes for a long time.
Yes.
If not indefinitely, with a lot of the types of modifications that Beth was talking about.
Yeah.
And the considerations. So I think that pretty much sums it up for today. Once again, yes, today's seminar has been taped, and it will be shared with everyone who registered for this program. We do invite you to join us for the rest of our 5-month series. If you have any questions on any of that, please call our offices at 734-998-9353. We would love to help get you registered if there are other things that you'd like to register for. And with that, Beth, did you have any last comments or things that you wanted to share with the audience?
I don't really. I came into this talk having no idea what kind of information people were looking for. So I hope it was helpful, and I wish you all the best.
I think the information was fantastic and very helpful. I really appreciate it. And on behalf of all the programs involved and the committee that put this together, and myself, of course, thank you so much for this amazing presentation today. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye.